is to do the introduction. I'll introduce you three, and then we'll get underway. Excellent. Okay. So welcome everyone to Canada's Sanctions in the World panel discussion. This event is being sponsored by the Royal United Service Institute, or RUSI, as well as the Centre for Defence and Security Studies, CDSS. The Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies within RUSI focuses its research on matters at the intersection of finance and security, including, of course, sanctions. CDSS is also proud to be a sponsor of this event. We have three panelists with us today, and to kick off our conversation is Andrea Charron, the director of CDSS and a professor of international relations at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada. She is the co-editor and author of 2 books on multilateral sanctions and several on defense policy. Following Andrea, we have Michael Nesbitt, who is an associate professor of law at the University of Calgary Faculty of Law, where he teaches and researches in the area of national security, autonomous sanctions, and criminal law. He has appeared numerous times before the House of Commons and Senate to discuss Canada's sanctions enforcement, and will teach the first law course in Canada devoted solely to the study of autonomous sanctions in the winter 2024 term. Before joining the Faculty of Law in 2015, he practiced law and worked for Global Affairs Canada on Middle East policy and autonomous sanctions, including as sanctions lead for Iran and Syria files. Finally, we will have Tom Keatinge, who is the founding director of the Centre for Financial Crimes and Security Studies at RUSI, where his research focuses on the matters at the intersection of finance and security. He is also currently a specialist advisor on illicit finance to the UK Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee ongoing inquiry. He has a master's in intelligence and international security from King's College London, where he studied the effectiveness of global counter-terror finance regimes. Prior to joining RUSI in 2014, he was an investment banker for 20 years at JP Morgan. And with that, I will hand it over to Andrea to kick off our conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Claire. And I'm really grateful to RUSI and Tom and his team for hosting this webinar, and for Michael Nesbitt for joining us today. What I'm going to do is provide sort of the context for Canadian sanctions, and I have 3 take-home messages. First, what I want everybody to realize is that we have a very contested world right now, which means how Canada has sanctioned and is going to sanction in the future has changed quite dramatically. Second, one of the perennial problems that Canadian companies, individuals, and banks have in ensuring sanctions compliance is that there is still a lack of guidance by Global Affairs Canada in terms of difficult cases and how to proceed. It is improving, but we still need to do more. And finally, after all of the academic research on what constitutes effective sanctions, we still seem to have a lot of those elements missing in a Canadian context. And I would suspect in the UK, EU, and the US as well, but it's particular to Canada in many ways. And so my bottom line up front is that the sanctions are the preferred coercive tool of the Government of Canada. But it really lacks efficacy, and that's for a number of reasons, including compliance difficulties and the fact that Canada does not have a sanctions regulator. So first, to orient you, Canada has sort of 2 buckets of sanctions. We can have multilateral sanctions, and those are usually prescribed by the UN Security Council. As a member of the UN, we are required by law if the UN Security Council applies mandatory sanctions. The other bucket of sanctions is what we refer to as autonomous sanctions. And that is when we are applying sanctions because Canada has determined by itself that it wants to apply sanctions, or it wants to augment UN sanctions. The multilateralness of sanctions. So when we look over here at the UN Security Council, many people think that multilateral just means lots of different states are sanctioning. It actually has more to do with the authority. And so multilateral sanctions are when the UN requires Canada and member states to sanction, or as a member of the Organization of American States, if they require member states to sanction, that's more of a multilateral. Autonomous sanctions are where there is no outside authority that is requiring the sanctions, but it is very much a decision by the government of Canada they want to do that. Now, for the UN sanctions, we have the UNA Act that will take a UN Security Council resolution and translate it into regulations. For the autonomous sanctions, we have two. We have the Special Economic Measures Act, and we have the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Official Act, or the Magnitsky Act is how it's better known. There is one other one that gets less attention, the FACFOA, and that is when a government asks Canada to seize assets that they know are based in Canada and have been illegally or inappropriately received by someone in Canada. Autonomous sanctions are the most common type of sanctions today because the UN Security Council is ideologically blocked on many occasions. And so we more and more are turning to the CIMA and the JVC FOA. Now, the latest measures that have been applied were against Haiti, and they were under the UN Act and also the Special Economic Measures Act. So if we map this all out, the three buckets look like this. CIMA is by far the most used piece of legislation by Canada, and you notice that Russia is under CIMA sanctions. This over here is another autonomous sanction measure, and we also have Russia over here in the Magnitsky. Now, they're used for different reasons. The CIMA is the most flexible, and it can deal with gross and systematic human rights violations, grave breaches to international peace and security, and acts of corruption. On the Magnitsky side, it's a little bit more limited. It can only sanction really individuals, and it is for gross violations of human rights and corruption. So for those sort of one-off acts, think, for example, when the reporter Khashoggi was murdered, the individuals implicated in that were implicated under the Magnitsky. Now, we list under Magnitsky state names, but really it's individuals. And so we sort of divorce the state from the individual who is targeted. The CIMA and the UN Act can use a variety of measures, arms embargoes, blocking services, blocking exports, seizing assets, and preventing individuals from coming into Canada. Now, the sanctions apply against Canadians anywhere in the world and Canadian companies, or anybody who happens to be in Canada, which can also be foreign nationals. Now, the penalties for contravening these various forms of sanctions do differ. And so if you're under the CIMA or the Magnitsky, if there's a summary conviction, it's $25,000 fine and up to 1 year prison term. And if it's a conviction on indictment, it's up to 5-year prison term. The UN sanctions have a higher maximum penalty. It's up to $100,000, and on conviction of indictment, a 10-year prison sentence. Now, there are occasions where when Canada sanctions a state, and we're now sanctioning in a more targeted targeted way. So it's not a blanket sanction of nothing in or out of a state. We tend to target individuals or even regions of countries or specific sectors. So, for example, lumber or coal. But even then, the Government of Canada, through the Minister of Foreign Affairs, can issue exceptions so that even if a country like, for example, Russia is sanctioned, but we want particular goods to be able to get in because, for example, they're for humanitarian purposes. NGOs in particular have difficulty getting these life-saving products into sanctioned countries because countries tend to de-risk and say, okay, we're not going to do any business with any state that's sanctioned. But if it's for the CIMA or the JVC FOA, the Minister of Foreign Affairs will issue a permit. But if it is for the UN, it's a certificate. This gets really complicated when, for example, you see that there are states that are sanctioned under both the CIMA and the UNA. And unlike other countries like the US that issues a license, and so it's, lasts for up to, let's say, a year, and it's for a variety of activities, our permits and certificate are very specific to the activity. And so you might have to request a lot of permits or certificates, and they can take quite some time to get sorted out. Now, the other problem and the perennial problem that we have in Canada is that Global Affairs is very resistant to provide any advice. And the reason is they tend to see that as legal advice, which they cannot provide. But there are all sorts of examples of where the UK and the US, for example, do provide their sanctions experts with advice and assistance. In fact, in the case of the US, OFAC officials will actually embed themselves in banks and big companies to help them with the complicated issue that is compliance of sanctions. Down here below is an example of what the UK pushes to anybody who subscribes. It gives me a hit, and I know that they've added new entries to the Russian financial sanctions regime, and there's a link that I can go and look. Canada doesn't have that sort of push out to people for that information. Finally, in terms of what makes sanctions effective, we know that if they're threatened and then responsive to activities, they tend to be more effective. In the case of Canada, it really depends. Often we want to make sure that we are sanctioning with allies, and so we have to wait for everybody to get on board. We don't communicate to targets of sanctions that they are in fact targeted, so in some cases they may not know. We do know that when sanctions are are multilateral or coordinated, they are better, and Canada does make a concerted effort to make sure that they're with their allies like the US, UK, and EU. We also know that sanctions are most effective when they're monitored and adjusted to events on the ground, and there's very little indication that this is happening. Canada just tends to add more names to a list rather than change the measures or communicate what are the end goals required of the target. In Canada, we have no requirement to review the stats of our sanctions and or report back to Parliament. We're hoping that will change. We also know that sanctions are more effective when they force the target to actually change the calculus of their thinking about what they do. And we know that sanctions generally have a really tough time doing that unless you're the US, which can give really biting sanctions. And finally, we know that sanctions are most effective when they're against democracies, because democracies tend to be more reactive. But of course, most of our sanctions are not against democracies. And I'll leave it there and hand it over to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And I want to also thank Tom and Andrea and Claire, our moderator, and CDSS and RUSI for having me here. It's a real pleasure. I'm going to pick up where Andrea left off, and I'm going to talk in particular about the enforcement side of sanctions. Now, I think the enforcement side is important for two reasons. I'm going to call that the sort of the front end of enforcement and the back end. So obviously the front end is, are we putting our money where our mouth is, to borrow from the monetary importance of sanctions, and are we actually enforcing these sanctions? In other words, do they actually have bite in Canada? The other issue is that, as I'm about to get to, with a lack of enforcement in Canada, that means a lack of judicial scrutiny to the laws that exist now. And the laws that exist now are largely untested. And while I personally think a number of recent changes to our laws in the last 2 or 3 years, especially, are probably lawful and were a good idea, I sort of have to say that. A number of them I've been advocating for a decade or more. That they also, in a number of cases, have not been used before. But more importantly, the reason I spent 10 years advocating for a number of these changes was what we heard from the government was they were self-evidently impractical and unlawful. And so we don't know what changed. All of a sudden, we just saw changed legislation. Again, I always disagreed with that position, but I think it's something that we certainly have to keep in mind if they were worried internally about the lawfulness of some of the measures that we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years. Then when it comes time to enforcement, one could expect a challenge to the laws themselves, which obviously would limit enforcement. So in terms of enforcement, when I say there's very little in Canada, I really mean it. And so I'm going to break it down, enforcement, into 3 areas, essentially. So the formal enforcement of the sanctions is essentially a criminal regime. And we have 3 cases in the history of Canada. So this is since the very early 1990s. So with the however many sanctions there are, individuals and entities sanctioned in Canada, thousands or more over those almost 40 years, and at 40 years plus now, we only have 3 cases, which is to say we have 3 enforcement actions. One of those was successful. One of those was dropped before it even got to trial at a preliminary stage for reasons we're not sure, but I will get to, which I think are reflective of a broader problem. And another was a guilty plea where, to put it bluntly, it appears no one in the process really understood the sanctions regime. We also have, and this is one of the new laws we have in place in Canada, that's a civil asset forfeiture regime. So that's I call this to our students, the take the yacht regime. So it will allow Canadians under a legal process, which has not been tested, to seize and forfeit to the government the assets of individuals or entities that have been sanctioned and that are resting in Canada. That I have seen publicly, we have 2 cases of asset forfeiture in this regard. Although again, we're talking the last year and a half to 2 years here. And finally, we have what I'll call the informal enforcement, which is really where the work is taking place. And that is, the assets are quote unquote frozen, but not by the government at all, by the banks. And so when the RCMP, for example, has been announcing here in Canada, many people will have read it here in the news, that we've frozen, as they often say, $135 million of assets from Russia. What I believe they actually mean is $135 million worth of largely financial transactions were stopped from going ahead by the bank. So these were not frozen necessarily in the sense that the money was prevented it would be prevented from reaching the individual to whom it's being sent, for example. It does not mean the money is being frozen. It's sort of sitting there in a Canadian bank account somewhere, ready to be redistributed to the government or decide whether to go back to the individuals. You simply wouldn't be allowed to make a bank transfer from Russia to Canada. I have started to call this the sort of the modern private policing approach, which is we're not going to do the enforcement ourselves. So we're going to outsource it to the banks, financial intermediaries, and financial institutions. We're not, as Professor Charron mentioned, we're not going to give any of them much information about our sanctions or our listing. So you'll get a list of sanctioned entities with a name on it. And often in Canada, that's it. You're not talking a passport number, you're not talking aliases, you're not talking the justification, particularly for many of our older sanctions. And so the banks will get a name and they will be told, don't allow any financial transactions with respect to this individual. They will have probably very little idea of perhaps who that individual is. And then what happens is, in the shadow of the law, the banks are determining through informal processes whether someone should be debanked, whether a transaction should be prevented, or assets should be quote unquote frozen. That brings us to my 3 problems with criminal enforcement in particular. So this is the state level enforcement as opposed to the enforcement that is done sort of by requiring the banks to uphold the sanctions regime through threats of criminal sanctions against the banks themselves. And those 3 problems are due process, and what I'll call just plain old process, transshipment and sanctions busting, and then if you're in Canada, the age-old intelligence to evidence problem, which is not unique to sanctions. It's a problem that exists with respect to espionage, foreign interference, terrorism, and sanctions. Anything in the national security realm, broadly understood, where we might be getting intelligence from a foreign government. Let me go through those in a little more detail then. When I'm talking about problems with respect to process and due process, some of the things I'm really worried about here is the problem with the listing of people and entities. And again, this gets back to something Professor Charron mentioned, which is we have an organization in global affairs that is responsible for the listing process, traditionally without much outside oversight, but which is not an intelligence gathering organization, which is not an investigative agency, and which is not an enforcement agency. Which means one would question right off the bat the capacity of that organization to collect sufficient evidence that could be presented at trial to justify a listing were it challenged in court. That's reinforced by the fact that you'll just see a name coming out of this, right? So in other words, it's not evident that when the listings take place, they even know when the date of birth is, or to use my name, that we know what Michael Nesbitt is being sanctioned if my name appeared on a sanctions list. Would we all end up being essentially debanked from the Canadian banking sector just through the informal banks processes? Then we have a problem with collecting open source intelligence. And so a lot of the information that would have to be used at trial will have to be open source intelligence. And yet again, we have the collection taking place, what seems, at least historically, to largely be within an organization that has not done this before. So as but one example, if you are collecting information from a foreign government or foreign company's website, are you hiding the fact that you're repeatedly visiting that website from Canadian government organization? That would be sort of your first step to doing open source investigation. It's not clear that that first step would even be followed within foreign affairs. And that brings me to the third problem, which is just that of skill set and coordination. So again, it's a problem inherent with this, but it's something that has to be worked on. And that is that if your organization neither does enforcement nor investigation, but is responsible for the file, it's necessarily the case that that organization must be then very good at coordination between those who are doing the enforcement, so the prosecutors, police, border services, as well as those who might help with the investigations, which would include domestic intelligence agencies as well as police agencies. We have seen some movement on this, particularly in recent years, which is extremely encouraging, and direct insertions into the legislation that would allow for more engagement from Canadian institutions like FinTrack and the RCMP, for example. And so I just wanted to put this slide up to sort of give a sense of how is it that we might capture a good or a service or a financial service in Canada, which gives a good overview of sort of where our problems might be. So one is we might simply capture it at the border. So that would be the transshipment of goods largely. One is the banks and financial sector would capture it. So here we're talking about the informal enforcement essentially. And the third way we might capture information, particularly financial information, is with intelligence. So that could be for a police force, it could be from an intelligence agency, and it could be from a foreign intelligence agency. Each of these will create different domestic enforcement problems within Canada. So where does that leave us then? Well, we have then an untested enforcement regime, shall I say. And so I do think there are some legal solutions and practical solutions that Canada can, and frankly, to Canada's credit and global affairs credit in the last several years, has been working towards. So that's continued allied coordination in this space and bringing in FinTrack, intelligence agencies, our domestic police force, the RCMP, and putting it directly in the legislation that they can work with global affairs has hopefully gone a long way to starting this process. The internal government coordination will be the next step, because that has a legal aspect, because the law cannot be upheld and enforced if the coordination and the work and the due process is not done at the front end. And so we have to see that in practice before we can make any comments about how that one is going. In terms of the legal side, I think one of the takeaways for Canada, especially with respect to Russia, when we've been claiming that these sanctions have a lot of bite and our main foreign policy tool, is we have to take enforcement of sanctions seriously. So put it bluntly, we have heard from a number of international organizations and intelligence agencies that sanction busting is taking place on Canadian soil. And so to see 2 or 3 enforcement actions through the government in a 40-year period is almost certainly insufficient. The next thing I would say is that we have to admit we support the U.S. sanctions. We've had an interesting, shall we say, national response to the U.S. approach, which is we coordinate all sanctions with the U.S., we support them, and we enjoy multilateral sanctions, and we think they're more effective. And so we try to work with the U.S. as much as possible. And also, when we don't like the U.S. sanctions, we then criticize them. And so there's particularly at an academic level, there's going to be a decision to take at some point in the future about how much we are going to continue to work with the US. And I think if we want our sanctions to be effective in Canada, from that perspective anyways, we're going to have to find a way to work with the US. Finally, I want to talk about legislative reform, and I can get more into this in the questions and answers, but one thing we have seen in the last couple of years is some legislative reform that has been really important in this area that will help with enforcement. And so I'm talking here about, again, incorporating the intelligence agencies. I'm talking here about dealing with the transshipments of goods. So allowing essentially the sanctioning of transshippers that may or may not be formally within the country that's being sanctioned, but nevertheless are essentially operating within that country. And then the final thing I just want to talk about really briefly is this intelligence to evidence problem, because it's the last problem we have in terms of enforcement. And so our conundrum is as follows. If we're not taking enforcement seriously, or national security enforcement seriously more broadly at domestic level, it means our intelligence, our evidence for trial will come from other states. And if that intelligence is coming from other states, and those other states are putting limits on how that intelligence can be used, and particularly if they're saying we either can't use it, or it discloses techniques or insiders in some way, and so it can't be used in court, that means that the intelligence upon which our cases are based can't be used in court, which means they're going to fall apart right at the outset. And when I started out, I said we have 3 cases and one fell apart right just before it got to trial. This appears to be exactly what happened. It fell apart before trial because we essentially did not produce enough evidence other than what's called hearsay to indicate that you even had sufficient indicia of guilt to get to trial, let alone to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that an individual was guilty. And my guess is, having seen that same individual sanctioned by the EU and spoken publicly by the EU about 6 months before, a good reason for that is that we were getting information from elsewhere and we're not able to use the information that we acted internally on within an open court setting. I will end there and leave any enforcement questions to the end. Thank you for your time.
Great, Mike. I guess it's my turn. Change of accent. Thank you both very much. Andrea, thanks for your partnership on that, and Claire, thanks for chairing. So obviously that's been quite detailed on the Canadian situation. So what I want to talk about is where we stand these days in Europe. And when I talk about Europe, I refer to the EU and the UK. I can't just say obviously the EU anymore, because whereas sanctions are becoming, as you guys have described, a sort of a foreign policy tool of interest, shall we say, in Canada. In Europe, there's a war on the border. And in Europe, sanctions are therefore, from the very start, were a tool that the EU and the UK obviously reached for in the hope that they could, as quickly as possible, well, first of all, deter Vladimir Putin from his invasion. And then once that clearly did not work, to restrict the funding and the resourcing of the Russian military to the extent that it would help the Ukrainians win the war, which of course they must do. Just a quick line on RUSI. So we're a defense and security think tank in London. As mentioned, I run the Financial Crime and Security Studies program, which we set up in 2014. The first bit of live TV I ever did for the BBC was to talk about Russia sanctions in 2014. And I think we do need to cast our mind back to that time, because there are lessons that in Europe have been learned from the failure of sanctions to really deliver anything after 2014, which, as you will have heard Ursula von der Leyen, the EU or the European Commission president, say in her visit to Kyiv last weekend, we cannot make the same mistake as in 2014, which essentially means issue sanctions and then think they're going to work and go home and celebrate victory, because obviously that absolutely was not the case. So it's a big part of our program at RUSI. What I think is also worth noting and has been slightly touched on is that I said in a recent interview I did with the Deputy Secretary of the US Treasury, Wally Adeyemo, I said, when it comes to sanctions, the UN is broken. And he pulled me up on that. And he said, well, no, he said it's not, because actually the UN, with the co-sponsorship of the US, did pass the humanitarian exemption not that long ago. And that's true. But the point that I meant was that the ability of the UN Security Council to pass new sanctions, particularly in contentious areas such as a permanent member's invasion of an innocent, peaceful neighbor, is obviously not going to happen. And so I think one of the things worth reflecting on is how the sanctioning countries around the world have had to adapt to that, and have had to in a way create their own Security Council, their own alliances. And you see that very strongly in the case of Russia, because of course the G7, as someone from the EU said to me yesterday, the G7 with a big plus is kind of central to the democratic world's response on sanctions to Russia's invasion. And it's a very unfortunate situation. Clearly, it's a tragic situation. But actually, I think what that's made a number of countries do is think more strategically about how they're going to use sanctions, and then figure out how tactically they can work together. So, for example, in the EU about a year ago, it was clear that the EU's ability to communicate about sanctions to what the EU calls third countries, so countries that aren't EU member states, was severely limited by the fact that there was not one individual who was really responsible for talking about sanctions to those third countries. Of course, there's the High Representative, who is sort of the EU's chief diplomat, but he has a huge mandate. What the EU needed was an envoy who could go to countries and talk specifically about sanctions and communicate what the EU's expectations were, what the sanctions that the EU had issued actually meant for a country like Kazakhstan or Turkey or the UAE. And so David O'Sullivan was put in that position, and that was a very important development. And I point to that because it kind of shows how the EU, and then each member state also has to have a sanctions envoy as well now, has had to really reorganize the way in which it thinks about sanctions. Sanctions are not just something that are announced as a signaling tool. They are a tool that certainly the EU wants to see have a genuine impact and lead to a behavioral change. So the Russian war in Ukraine has kind of changed that the way of thinking on this side of the Atlantic when it comes to sanctions. The UK has always been more kind of hawkish on sanctions, but certainly, of course, until recently, had to follow the way in which the EU decided to use sanctions. And in fact, it's interesting to note that when the UK left the EU, one of the foreign policy points that was regularly made was that the EU would have its own independent sanctions policy, and it would use it as a force for good and all that sort of stuff. Of course, it didn't really get very far down that track, although it did introduce its own human rights regime and its own anti-corruption regimes. But it didn't get very far down that track before it had to come alongside all its allies in responding to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. So I think there are a lot of lessons, just strategically, a lot of lessons that can be learned from the situation in Ukraine, and the importance of sanctions as a response of solidarity to Ukraine from its Western allies. But we can't take this for granted. And I think one of the things we need to think about is how do we ensure that with the UN Security Council sidelined in all of this, that countries like the UK, like Canada, the European Union, Australia, and others actually create lasting connections on sanctions that can outlast Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, and secondly, can sustain in a time when the UN Security Council is unable to function. And I think Canada obviously has an important role to play in that, frankly, because the US has always been the kind of the gorilla when it comes to sanctions. It has the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar. It has the kind of its reach around the world. But I think if countries like Canada and the UK, the sort of medium powers, shall we say, can work together in a more consensual manner, perhaps that will be a good thing. So specifically on what has been happening in Europe, I think the first thing to say, well, I should say that we run a project at RUSI called SIFMANET, which focuses on the implementation and effectiveness of sanctions in the EU and by member states. And that's the first thing to note, is that in the EU, it is the member state competence to implement the sanctions. So the sanctions are agreed in Brussels, and then everyone runs back to their individual countries and says, right, what do we do now? And the clear early finding of our research visits was that actually in many countries, they simply didn't have the right legislation to implement the sanctions on Russia. So if you look at news reporting during the course of 2022, you will find that the amount of new legislation being pumped out by EU member states, significant legislation being pumped out by EU member states as they realized that actually they didn't have the powers they needed, is considerable. And even now, at an EU level, sanctions evasion is not criminalized. That's something which is working through the EU system at the moment. So the EU member states had to really sort their houses out fast. And whereas you both identified gaps in what's happening in Canada and so on, and of course we should fix those, when it's trucks crossing the border from Latvia into Russia and it's happening in real time, you better have the right laws in place if you want to actually implement the sanctions and have the effect that you want them to have. So implementation was the first thing, and really 2022 was about waking up to that challenge, and then 2023 has been about trying to implement as effectively as possible. The second point is circumvention. So as everyone I'm sure will have seen, there have been considerable efforts by European countries together with the United States in making visits to places like Kazakhstan to go, look, come on guys, you really don't need 400% more microchips this year. Get smart. These are your companies are acting as cutouts in trade with Russia, for example. So circumvention has been, if you like, one of the words of the year in Europe, and the likes of David O'Sullivan, who I mentioned, the sanctions envoy, and others have made plenty of trips to those countries to try and essentially say, look, you can make your own choices if you want to. You can choose to continue to trade with Russia, but be clear that those companies that trade with Russia will not be able to trade with the European Union. You make your choice. You can have a small bit of trade with Russia, or you can have a big bit of trade with the EU. And that's kind of how the EU has tried to finesse this issue, which it has always been very clear that how you act in the face of sanctions is a country's sovereign right, in autonomous sanctions, so non-UN Security Council sanctions. But at the same time, it's our sovereign right as the European Union to decide how to respond to the way that you are reacting. So circumvention, sort of the soft movement on circumvention has been very active this year. And then enforcement, and everyone's talked about enforcement, and Mike went into detail on this. There is essentially very little enforcement capability and capacity in the European Union. It is still the case that if you are a bank or a company in Europe and you're asked to fill in the blank in the following sentence, who do you fear when it comes to enforcement? The answer will be OFAC, the United States Treasury. It will not be my local sanctions enforcement unit, because there probably isn't one. So this enforcement issue is a big challenge. We also haven't had the opportunity to visit Canada with our kind of workshop program, but it's kind of been interesting to listen to Michael and Andrea about, and imagine what we might find. And I think what we would find in Canada, from what you have been saying, is what we find across Europe, which is a kind of fragmented architecture, laws which it wasn't envisaged that the unfortunate circumstances of Russia invading Ukraine would occur. And so, are the laws really fit for purpose? And people have obviously been working hard in parliaments around the world to try and fix those, but we simply weren't we weren't ready. Coordination between government agencies is a huge problem in many countries in Europe, and clearly the same in Canada. So I think, just to conclude, until February 2022, in fact, in a number of the interviews we've done, people have been very honest and said, in Poland or in Czech Republic or wherever it might be, sanctions were not something we really cared about. There weren't many people from Zimbabwe with their assets in our country. In fact, there were none. There wasn't much trade going on with Syria or whatever sanctions regime you might be thinking of. But there is huge integration between Russia and the European economy, and therefore we actually do need to care about sanctions. And in a way, we need to catch up with all the work we should have done over the years, having a sound and robust sanctioning capability. We've had to catch up very quickly on that neglect in the space of the months that have passed since February 2022. And then the last point, just to re-emphasize, is the question of collaboration. We are going to have to work together as democratic nations if we think sanctions are a foreign policy tool which is going to be central to how we operate around the world. We need to collaborate, and Canada needs to make sure it's in the tent, as it were, not sitting outside and waiting to follow. Claire, to you.
Thank you so much, you three, for 3 incredible discussions and commentary on sanctions in Canada. I would like to put it out to those in the audience who have joined us. You're more than welcome to ask any questions to any 3 of our panelists. But I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with my first question, which we've heard from all 3 of you that sanctions have been problematic in terms of enforcement, in terms of legislation, in terms of government involvement. So my question is, are sanctions actually worth it? Is it worth going through the hassle to get all of this fixed? Is there a different foreign policy tool that might be better? And if we decide that sanctions are the way to go, what is your advice to the government of Canada, or perhaps the UN more broadly, or the EU, on what we can do to make this a better enforcement tool and more effective? I will let any one of the 3 of you begin with that, answering this question.
Well, Claire, I can start. I think your question about are sanctions worth it, it depends on who you ask. Because if you ask the government of Canada, are sanctions worth it? Absolutely. This is one of their best communication tools to Canadians and to allies, to say that we are doing something and we are doing it in concert with like-minded individuals. And to the target, it's a great way to communicate and underline, we're not happy with this behavior. Now, if you're going to ask the target, is this worth it? I think many targets, don't know that they're targeted by Canadian sanctions, or, it's like a mosquito bite. It's an annoyance. Worse, it becomes a badge of honor and gives them legitimacy in a way that we don't want to give legitimacy. If you ask Canadians, I think many think of them as sort of magic. Sanctions they just happen. And of course, we want more sanctions. So in terms of advice to the government of Canada, and this has been repeated many times, they are becoming more complicated. There are things like cryptocurrencies and knowing your customer and all of these things that really require government to work hand in hand with industry and banks and businesses, because they're in the front line in terms of compliance. But I would say, I think the government of Canada needs to take a good hard look at their metric for success. And it seems to be, how long can that list of targets be? And let's just keep throwing target names on it. But I really think what you need to do is think, for my metric of success would be a small list, but it's one that's reactive to events on the ground, that we have concrete evidence of their activity, that we have information we can share with both the public and the target about this is why we're doing it, and communicating this is what we need to have happen for them to be lifted, because that's the one communication piece that I think all governments miss. It's, we are applying sanctions and we're not going to tell you when, if ever, the sanctions are going to come off. And so, we have UN sanctions that have been in place, for 20, 30 years. At that point, what role are they playing?
If I may, I would agree with much of that. So it's a question which we ask in Europe all the time, because, again, in contrast to the position that Canada is in, the sanctions on Russia have a blowback on Europe, right? There are companies that I'm sure have gone bust because they had clients who were predominantly in Russia, and they can no longer deal with those clients, either because of, not necessarily because they're engaging in sanctioned activity, but there are no banking channels for receiving payments anymore, and that sort of thing. And so communicating to the public and to voters what the purpose of sanctions is, how are they having a positive impact, so generating a narrative around them is really important. And you see, we unfortunately we have elections in countries, and they kind of get in the way of the desires of governments to take certain measures. And it's a minority, but nonetheless there are certainly people who would vote in favor of having fewer sanctions, or a party that advocated fewer sanctions. And in some countries in Europe, that feeling is very strong. So a narrative for the public is very important. Andrea mentioned the private sector. Let's not forget, it's the private sector that we are expected to implement these sanctions. So the private sector better be understanding what it is they're trying to achieve, and how they should contribute if we want the sanctions to be effective. The reality is that I think policymakers, so I go back, and if you look at the rhetoric on sanctions against Russia in the period in late 2021 and January 2022, there are many policymakers who overstated, in my view, the potential value of sanctions. And so, of course, they were disappointed, or their populations were disappointed, when, to use Boris Johnson's phrase, a Russian military toe cap did cross the border into Ukraine. So, I think there's a communication on sanctions is really, really important. What are you trying to achieve? To Andrea's point, how are they reversible? I would recommend people look at the US Treasury's sanction strategy review, which was published at the end of 2021, because it has a very simple framework, which I actually think, if we were to follow that, might help us communicate sanctions more effectively. So are they worth it? I don't think it's a question we can really ask ourselves. They're here, we use them. So how do we make sure we use them as effectively as possible?
Tom, if I can jump in, because I agree with everything you've said. And I think one of the things we're going to look at internally within a government, or one hopes we would look at, is they're here and we're using them, but obviously we're using them because we think they're getting a reaction, right? Because we think there's something that's effective about them. And so I do think it's important to articulate that. And so one of those things is, look, when Russia invaded the Ukraine, the public in Canada and elsewhere is understandably going to expect a response. And I've always understood sanctions at a most basic level to be a better alternative for that response than war. And so if this is the best alternative we have, then it's something to look very closely at. And it's something to invest in, both in terms of the processes and the studies of. I think that's actually backed up, at least in Canada, when you look at the Russian sanctions in particular, because when we announce a large list of Russian sanctions persons and entities, if they are close to leadership, you'll see a reaction in Russia. That is, you will see a quid pro quo, where Canadians will then end up on the Russian list. If the Russians didn't care about them, if they didn't think it had any bite, if it didn't have any international influence, they would ignore it completely. They would not be spending their time on this. So I think there's, from a Canadian perspective, there's value there too. Now, we might not be quantifiable or empirically able to measure it, but we can look at the reaction from foreign states and saying, this is at least having an influence on how things are perceived and what they think the damage will be from these sanctions. They're sufficient enough to take the time to react to. Cynically, I think we as Canadians have to just be careful about something on the sanctions file, and that is they're a wonderful communications tool. If you want to communicate to the public that you are really tough and doing a lot while investing nothing in national defense and outsourcing almost all of the enforcement to the private sector and Canadian large and mid-sized businesses, then sanctions are the perfect tool. It's zero risk, all reward. You can rest your foreign policy laurels going into an election basically on those sanctions announcements and the outcrop of them. So I think there's a cynical consideration there for governments, but also Canadians have to be aware of that, which brings me to my last question, which is one both Andrea and Tom have spoken about, which is we're going to have to get a little more empirical about this stuff. And empirical, I don't just mean quantitatively measuring the impact of sanctions, though gosh, that would help, especially if it was done within governments and sort of follow up on what's working or whether people should be added or removed from a list, or names have changed or companies have changed or expanded and should expand lists. I'm also thinking about the other side, and I suppose that's because I'm a lawyer, but I'm saying you have to measure the drawbacks of these two. What is the cost to the private sector? And with all due respect to our big banks, which is a highly important part of the Canadian financial sector, I'm more concerned about the small and medium-sized businesses that are asked to enforce a regime that is hard to understand, with very little legal guidance, with virtually no government support at this time, and serious risk to themselves. And I'm also worried about something I touched on in my presentation, which is if the banks are operating in the shadow of the law as sort of a private policing enforcement wing of the government, unwitting to the banks, right? This is sort of being pushed down on them from the government, and fair enough because it's effective. But how comfortable are we with the process of ensuring that the wrong people aren't debanked? And that really, to me, gets to the heart of it. If you put one name on it and don't tell you anything about that name, how comfortable am I that only the intended target is actually being debanked in that situation? Because we're talking about serious, especially in a country like Canada with our winters, which is just approaching here in the prairies, serious repercussions to childhood education, housing, access to day-to-day goods, particularly in the current economy. If you're getting kicked out of a bank or multiple banks because you've been wrongly listed, and it's not clear how you get off that because there isn't a government process in place, because it's a private decision by a bank, which has made been made largely probably by a computer picking up on numbers, or maybe AI picking up on a number of factors that they've put into an equation, then we have serious drawbacks for the Canadian public, and those have to be part of our measurement in terms of how broadly we enforce it, which probably gets you back to Andrea's point, which is maybe then you start thinking about, should we have a fewer number of listed persons and entities, but more targeted, and more certainty around who those people are, what their other businesses are. We have new deemed ownership provisions in Canada, but do we know who the other owners are, right? I mean, most sophisticated actors are not just going to open a second company in their name and list it as such on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So how are we putting maybe more money into that back end as well?
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm cognizant of the time that we are at the top of the hour, so I wanted to go ahead and again say thank you so much to RUSI and CDSS for sponsoring and contributing to this panel discussion. I hope everyone was able to take something away, and that change is coming, hopefully. So thank you everyone so much for your participation, and we will talk again soon.